There is a particular kind of silence that follows a hit show's final episode, not the applause kind, but the uneasy quiet that comes when the story ends too abruptly and the official explanation sounds too polished. When Kitchen Nightmares disappeared from Fox's schedule in 2014, the public version of events felt clean, almost convenient. The show had run for years, it had done its job, and television moves on. Yet the longer people sat with it, the stranger it seemed. This was not a series limping to the finish line. It was a cultural machine that still pulled viewers in week after week, built around one of the most recognizable personalities in modern food television. A format like that does not vanish without friction. What makes the mystery stick is the contrast between what viewers saw and what the job likely demanded. On screen, the chaos looked contained, edited into a neat arc of failure, confrontation, renovation, redemption. Off-screen, the work was repetitive exposure to the worst versions of the restaurant business. Not the romantic version with white jackets and applause, but the version with spoiled product, questionable sanitation, exhausted staff, owners in denial, and kitchens that could turn a tasting into a genuine health risk. Even in the recent revival era, mainstream entertainment coverage still points to incidents where Ramsay suspects he's been made ill while filming, a reminder that the dangers in those kitchens are not theatrical props. Over time, the bigger threat is not a single bad meal. It is futility. Restaurant rescues promise transformation, but restaurants do not survive on transformation alone. They survive on disciplined cash flow and daily decisions made when the cameras are gone. Independent tracking sites that follow the series featured businesses estimate that roughly 4 out of 5 U.S. restaurants showcased by Kitchen Nightmares have ultimately closed. If you are Gordon Ramsay, a man whose entire public identity is built around standards and repeatable excellence, that statistic is not just disappointing. It is corrosive. Every closure becomes a silent footnote attached to your name, a reminder that the makeover may have been real, but the permanence was not guaranteed. That is the uncomfortable hinge in this story. The show worked because it made change look immediate, but the real world rarely rewards immediate change unless it is sustained. And sustained change requires something television cannot reliably manufacture. An owner who genuinely wants to be better tomorrow, next month, next year, without a production crew watching. Accounts about the 2014 ending often return to this pressure point. The growing realization that many of the businesses were beyond a one-week intervention, and that Ramsay's frustration with the underlying premise likely intensified as the years went on. Once you see the pattern, the job stops feeling like rescue and starts feeling like exposure. You can renovate a dining room, redesign a menu, retrain a staff, but you cannot install integrity where it does not exist, and you cannot force accountability on someone who views the entire experience as free marketing. The most unsettling version of the story is not that some restaurants failed anyway. It is that some people may never have intended to change at all, that the cameras were the goal, not the wake-up call. In that world, the host is not a mentor. He becomes a prop, a brand stamp that can be exploited. The timeline makes the ending feel sharper. Kitchen Nightmares ran for years in the U.S. and then stopped, only to return in 2023, nearly a decade later, in a different cultural climate, after a pandemic that battered the restaurant industry and shifted public sympathy towards struggling businesses. The return suggests the concept was never entirely dead. What died, at least for a time, was a willingness to keep doing it under the old terms, with the old risks, and with outcomes that could quietly erode the credibility of the very person people tuned in to trust. So when you ask why it ended in 2014, the answer that lingers is not ratings. It is endurance. It is the accumulation of kitchens that would not stay clean, owners who would not stay accountable, and failures that could follow Ramsay like shadows long after credits rolled. At a certain point, stepping back is not quitting. It is refusing to keep endorsing a process that no longer aligns with the standard you built your name on. Back in 2004, the idea sounded almost too simple to become a global phenomenon. Find a restaurant on the brink of collapse. Bring in a chef with uncompromising standards, and let the audience watch the mess get stripped down to the studs. In the UK version, the tension came from the contrast between pride and reality. A dining room full of excuses, a kitchen full of shortcuts, and a mentor who refused to soften the truth. Gordon Ramsay already had a reputation in the industry, but television gave that reputation a new kind of reach. It turned his intensity into a narrative engine. When the concept crossed the Atlantic and launched in America in 2007, it didn't just translate, it expanded. The stakes became louder, the characters more extreme, and emotional swings more theatrical. Viewers weren't only watching food improve. They were watching people get cornered by consequences. Ramsay's bluntness, his impatience with laziness, his refusal to accept good enough, all of it became the signature. For 7 years, the rhythm stayed familiar because it worked. Shock, confrontation, transformation, hope. The ratings and recognition made it feel like the formula could run forever. On the surface, it looked like the kind of success story television executives dream about, a show that could keep replenishing itself because there would always be another failing restaurant, another broken team, another owner begging for one last chance. But a format that thrives on dysfunction quietly collects a debt. Every episode requires a new disaster. Every week, you have to walk into another kitchen where standards have collapsed, and you have to play the same role in conditions that are rarely controlled. The audience experiences it as entertainment, but the work itself is repetitive exposure to failure, and the transcript you provided leans heavily on that contrast. It suggests that while the viewers were enjoying the spectacle of Ramsay tearing into bad food and bad management, he was internalizing something far more uncomfortable: the limits of what his intervention could actually accomplish once the production left town. Because the truth about restaurant turnarounds is that the hardest part is not the makeover. It's the morning after. It's the quiet Tuesday when there is no crew, no spotlight, no pressure being watched, and the owner has to choose whether to hold the line or slip back into old habits. The transcript claims that a large majority of the American restaurants featured eventually closed, and even if the exact percentage is debated in real-world tracking, the emotional meaning remains the same. For someone like Ramsay, whose brand is built on the idea that discipline creates results, repeated closures are not just unfortunate outcomes. They feel like personal failures stacked one on top of another. The story becomes darker when you consider what the transcript frames as the real pattern behind those closures. It wasn't simply that the restaurants were struggling. It was that many of the owners were struggling in ways a one-week reset could never solve. Some were locked in financial troubles that ran too deep. Some carried personal burdens that didn't disappear because a new menu was printed. Some, according to the narrative, were never truly committed to change. The moment the camera stopped rolling, the urgency drained out of the room, and the old routines crept back in like smoke. Staff training got ignored. Standards slipped. Shortcuts returned. The transformation became a moment in time rather than a new reality. That's where the psychological pressure starts to turn into something more corrosive. Ramsay didn't just come to fix equipment and recipes. He came to fix leadership. And leadership is the one thing you cannot install like a new oven. The transcript suggests that over time he began to recognize a painful truth. No amount of expertise can compensate for an owner who doesn't want to be accountable. Some people, it implies, treated the experience as free publicity. They performed remorse when the cameras were pointed at them, then revealed a different face once filming wrapped. In that scenario, the host becomes less of a mentor and more of a prop, a famous stamp that can be exploited without honoring the responsibility that should come with it. Then there's a physical dimension, the part that makes a story feel less like burnout and more like damage. The transcript references food poisoning and health strain, and even at the very beginning, it drops a grim detail about ulcers that hints at chronic stress. Ramsay's entire career is rooted in mastery of food and standards, yet the job required him to taste meals prepared in environments that were, at times, unsafe. Eating in those kitchens wasn't an act of culinary curiosity. It was an occupational hazard. When that hazard repeats, it changes your relationship to work. You stop feeling like you are walking into a challenge. You start feeling like you are walking into a risk. As seasons went on, the glamour of saving restaurants could easily curdle into a different sensation. The dread of realizing you are fighting a battle the other side may not even want to win. The transcript frames Ramsay as someone who built his empire through excellence. And that word matters because excellence is not episodic. It is daily. It is the same standards, The same discipline, the same uncomfortable honesty repeated until it becomes culture. If most of the restaurants were slipping back after he left, then the show's mission wasn't failing. Because Ramsay didn't know what he was doing. It was failing because a format couldn't guarantee the one ingredient that matters most: sustained ownership of change. And that is the kind of realization that doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates quietly while the world celebrates your success. It grows behind the scenes while nominations and ratings tell everyone else the machine is still working. It's the private math of knowing that each new episode might be another story where the happy ending only lasts until the credits roll. The transcript points toward a moment where that private math became unbearable, where the show that made him a television star began to feel like a slow erosion of his standards, his health, and his credibility. The next part is where that erosion collides with a specific experience that, in the story you provided, pushed him past the point of compromise. The turning point in stories like this is rarely a single explosion. It is usually a slow leak, pressure building over years until one final moment makes everything obvious. By 2014, the transcript suggests Gordon Ramsay had already carried the weight of hundreds of confrontations. Owners who blamed everyone but themselves, staff trapped in toxic routines, kitchens so poorly run that service felt like controlled collapse. He had seen stubbornness, delusion, incompetence, and dysfunction in every variation. None of that was new. What was new, what the transcript frames as the true breaking point, was meeting an owner who wasn't failing because he couldn't change, but because he didn't want to. That distinction matters. In earlier seasons, Ramsay's role worked because there was at least a chance of transformation. Even the most offensive owners could, under enough pressure, crack and admit the truth. Once they admitted the truth, you could rebuild. That's a moral engine of Kitchen Nightmares. The idea that honesty is a door and discipline is a path. But the restaurant described in the transcript, set in a remote ski resort in southern France, was built around a different engine entirely: a captive market. Guests at the resort had limited options. They were, in practical terms, trapped. And the owner, as the transcript paints him, treated that fact like a license to behave badly. Inflated prices, substandard food, a casual disregard for the customer's experience. Not because the kitchen lacked talent or the staff lacked training, but because the business model didn't depend on loyalty. It depended on geography. If you want to understand why this would hit Ramsay harder than the average failing diner, imagine what it does to the show's premise. Most restaurants in the series are struggling because they've lost trust. Customers have choices, and they choose to stay away. The rescue is an attempt to earn that trust back through improved quality and leadership. But a place that survives by removing choice turns that logic upside down. You can't win customers back if the customer was never free to leave in the first place. That is why the transcript's tone changes here. The conflict stops being technical, recipes, systems, cleanliness, and becomes ethical. Ramsay, a chef who built his name on standards and respect for craft, walks into a business that appears to treat standards as optional and customers as unavoidable. The usual Ramsay approach, direct confrontation, only works if the person on the other end has a relationship with shame. Shame is the moment you realize you're wrong and feel the need to correct it. But in the transcript's version of events, the owner didn't have that relationship. He didn't want correction. He wanted exposure. He wanted the cameras. He wanted the marketing. The restaurant didn't need Ramsay's help as much as it wanted Ramsay's spotlight. This is where the emotional toll becomes something sharper than frustration. Because if Ramsay is right, then the work isn't merely difficult. It's being used. And being used in this context is not an ego bruise. It is a brand threat. Ramsay's credibility is not a vague idea. It is an asset. It is a foundation that supports his restaurants, his partnerships, his shows, and the trust audiences place in him as a judge of quality. Every episode of Kitchen Nightmares functions like an endorsement that says, this is worth fixing. This owner can change. This business deserves a chance. When the owner is fundamentally indifferent to change, the episode becomes a problem. It doesn't just risk failure. It risks misrepresentation. It risks the audience watching Ramsay invest his skill and reputation into a person who has no intention of honoring either. The transcript describes the filming as increasingly tense, and that makes sense because tension is not just about arguments. It's about the feeling of futility in real time. Picture the daily rhythm. Ramsay points out obvious issues, demands accountability, tries to show a better way. The owner pushes back, not from insecurity, but from contempt. Not from fear, but from calculation. The cameras capture the confrontation, but off-camera the dynamic doesn't improve because the owner's incentives don't align with improvement. He has customers regardless. He has attention now. He has nothing to lose by resisting. At that point, the show's mechanics start to resemble a loop with no exit. Ramsay can't walk away mid-episode without undermining the story. He can't soften his critique without betraying his standards. He can't force the owner to care. So he becomes stuck, doing the work, knowing the outcome, feeling the hollowness of the entire exercise. The transcript includes a line that cuts like a verdict. This wasn't someone who lacked knowledge or resources. It was someone who lacked basic integrity. That is a devastating assessment because it implies the core problem isn't fixable by training or money. Integrity is not installed. It's either present or it's not. And that's where the final straw forms. Because the more Ramsay fights, the more he realizes he isn't repairing a restaurant. He is fighting against someone's character. He has tried to enforce standards in a space where standards were never the goal. The transcript describes Ramsay reaching absolute clarity one morning during filming. He was done with that restaurant, and done with the concept as it existed. That moment is psychologically credible because it's the kind of clarity you only get when you've been compromising for too long. For years, Ramsay had likely told himself that even if many restaurants failed later, the effort was still meaningful. That at least some owners changed. That at least some staff learned better practices. That the mission justified the mess. But a situation like the ski resort reframes the entire project in one brutal question. If someone can exploit customers, resist help, and still benefit from the show's publicity, what am I actually producing? Then the decision becomes less dramatic and more inevitable. According to the transcript, Ramsay didn't cancel because Fox demanded it. He canceled because continuing felt like a betrayal of what he stood for. Not just because the failure rate was high, but because the process forced him into repeated association with businesses that didn't deserve his credibility. It turned his passion into a performance, his standards into content, and his name into a stamp that others could misuse. That is when the story shifts from why did the show end to why couldn't it continue? And once you accept that framing, the next part, the phone call to Fox, the executives trying to negotiate, the idea of taking a break versus shutting it down entirely, stops sounding like TV drama and starts sounding like a man drawing a line around his own integrity. The public likes to imagine that a show ends the way a season ends, a final episode, a neat conclusion, a goodbye that feels planned. But the transcript frames the end of Kitchen Nightmares as something far messier, more like a sudden decision made in the middle of exhaustion, when a person realizes the cost has quietly become greater than the reward. After the French ski resort experience, the story doesn't describe Ramsay as angry in a way viewers were used to seeing performative, explosive, good television angry. It describes something colder and more dangerous, a kind of disgust that comes when your work stops feeling meaningful. The difference matters. Anger can still be productive. Disgust is often final. Because once you accept that some owners can't be helped, not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack integrity, you start to reevaluate every episode that came before. You start to wonder how many people were truly committed to change and how many were simply playing a role for cameras. And if that question becomes loud enough in your head, it poisons the entire process. Every new restaurant stops being a fresh challenge and starts feeling like the same gamble with the same likely ending, not because you doubt your skills, but because you doubt the premise. The transcript suggests Ramsay reached that point of clarity mid-filming. He looked around at the situation, the resistance, the futility of trying to reform someone who didn't respect the customer, and he made a decision that would shock everyone. He wasn't going to keep doing it. Not later. Not after one more season. He was finished. And then comes a moment that turns a personal breaking point into an industry earthquake. The phone call, the The transcript emphasizes that Ramsay didn't route the decision through layers of agents, lawyers, or carefully staged announcements. He called Fox directly. That detail is important because it shows how absolute his decision had become. In the television world, big shows usually end with negotiations, exit strategies, options, and soft landings. But in this telling, Ramsay's approach was blunt. He would rather face an awkward, immediate conversation than continue a project that felt like a compromise of his standards and health. You can almost picture the executive's reaction, disbelief first, then urgency, because from their perspective, Kitchen Nightmares wasn't a niche series. It was a proven asset. It delivered audience, brand recognition, cultural conversation. It was safe in a business built on uncertainty. The transcript describes Fox executives trying to talk him out of it, and that too is psychologically credible. Networks do not let go of profitable franchises easily, especially when there is no obvious external reason forcing their hand. So the negotiation begins, not in the formal sense, but in the practical sense of people trying to keep a machine running. Maybe you just need a break. Maybe we reduce the episode order. Maybe we stretch the production schedule. Maybe we tweak the format. These are the kinds of solutions executives offer because they think the problem is workload. But the transcript is explicit. Ramsay's objection wasn't the schedule. It was a futility. If you believe the mission is flawed, if you believe 1 week of intervention cannot reliably fix the deep causes of failure, then reducing the number of episodes doesn't solve anything. It simply reduces the number of times you repeat a broken equation. And there's another layer the transcript builds toward: brand risk. For the network, Ramsay is the show. That's not a compliment. It's a dependency. You cannot replace him and expect the same result. The format doesn't stand on its own because the audience isn't watching a generic rescue. They're watching Ramsay's standards collide with chaos. Without him, the show loses its identity. That gives him leverage. But it also gives him responsibility. Every restaurant that fails after being featured becomes a tiny crack in the illusion of rescue. And the more cracks there are, the more his credibility risks becoming collateral damage. From this angle, canceling the show becomes a strategic act of self-protection. Not in a cynical way, but in a professional way. A chef's reputation is built on outcomes, not intentions. Ramsay could pour everything he had into these rescues, but he couldn't control what happened after he left. And as the transcript argues, the failure rate and regression patterns were not isolated. They were structural. Continuing the show meant continuing to be publicly linked to outcomes that might contradict the Ramsay fixes everything mythology that TV had helped create. The transcript frames the call as awkward because it flips the usual power dynamic. Normally, a network tells a star, "We're moving on." Here, the star tells a network, "I'm moving on." That forces the executives into a position they hate. Try and persuade the person who holds a value to keep delivering it. And it also exposes the uncomfortable truth that Kitchen Nightmares was never just an idea. It was a relationship between a brand and an audience, and Ramsay's brand was the keystone. At some point, the conversation stops being about business and becomes about boundaries. Ramsay, in this narrative, is not asking for better terms. He is drawing a line. He is saying, I cannot keep investing my health, my time, and my credibility into a process that repeatedly produces failure and worse, sometimes rewards the wrong people with attention. That is why the transcript calls this decision something that haunted him for years. It's not easy to walk away from a hit you built. It's not easy to disappoint millions of viewers who genuinely believed in the rescues. It's not easy to step away from a cultural role that has become synonymous with your public identity. But walking away can still be the only option when the role has started to distort what you stand for. And the most telling detail is this. Fox tried to negotiate the surface-level problem, but Ramsay was reacting to the deeper one. The issue wasn't exhaustion alone. It was a fear that continuing would turn his standards into entertainment, while eroding their meaning in real life. The show didn't end because the audience stopped watching. In this telling, it ended because Ramsay stopped believing the format could honor the values he built his career on. And once that belief is gone, no schedule adjustment can bring it back. If the cancellation call was the earthquake, what came after was the aftershock. Proof that the industry didn't just lose a show, it lost a formula that had printed attention for years. Fox could accept that Gordon Ramsay was exhausted, even accept that he was angry, but what the transcript implies they struggled to accept was this: Ramsay wasn't negotiating terms. He was rejecting the underlying premise. And when a premise collapses, you can't fix it with a smaller episode order and a better hotel. So the network did what networks always do when a franchise dies with its star still alive. It tried to recreate the product without admitting what made the original irreplaceable. The transcript frames a 3-year period persuasion, attempts to bring Ramsay back to the rescue format in some new shape, some redesigned container that would keep the audience and reduce the damage. That effort became 24 Hours to Hell and Back in 2018. Pitched like an upgrade, the problem wasn't rescuing restaurants. The pitch implied it was the timeline, the exposure, the prolonged suffering of spending a week inside dysfunction. So compress it, make it faster, make it more tactical. Give Ramsay less time to be dragged into an owner's endless excuses. On paper, this sounds rational. In operational terms, it's a classic constraint approach. Reduce cycle time, reduce variability, reduce time spent in the worst conditions. The transcript highlights 2 key changes. First, the full transformation had to be done in 24 hours, eliminating the week-long immersion. Second, Ramsay initially went undercover, observing the restaurant as a regular customer before revealing himself, a move designed to avoid the camera performance behavior that can appear when participants know the spotlight is on them. Those adjustments aimed at one obvious problem: authenticity. If owners and staff behave differently on camera, you're not fixing the real business. You're fixing a performance. Undercover observation is, in theory, a way to diagnose the true baseline before participants can manipulate their image. But here's where the transcript's logic gets sharper. It suggests that even these changes couldn't solve what actually killed Kitchen Nightmares: futility and follow-through. The 24-hour timeline created a new set of problems. A restaurant turnaround isn't just a renovation and a menu rewrite. It's culture change, systems, standards, leadership habits that have to be enforced daily. Compressing the work into 24 hours makes the transformation feel spectacular, but it can also make it feel superficial. It leaves less time to break down denial, less time to build genuine accountability, less time to see whether the owner can hold a line when stress hits. So the show faced an impossible trade-off. If it moved fast enough to avoid prolonged exposure to toxic conditions, it risked looking like a rushed makeover. If it slowed down to deepen change, it risked repeating the very grind that had burned Ramsay out in the first place. The transcript also emphasizes a viewer response. People complained it felt overly scripted, artificially dramatic, and less emotionally earned. That criticism matters because it highlights an uncomfortable truth about the original. Kitchen Nightmares worked because the narrative felt like a real fight. The tension wasn't only shouting. It was a sense that Ramsay was genuinely trying to pull someone back from the edge. When the format becomes too compressed, the fight can start to look staged. The before and after happen so quickly that audiences struggle to believe the internal change happened at all. And that's where the replacement becomes, ironically, evidence for Ramsay's original decision. The transcript argues that the failure of 24 Hours to Hell and Back didn't merely disappoint viewers. It exposed why Kitchen Nightmares had been special. It balanced drama with enough time to build stakes, enough immersion to reveal character, enough friction for transformation to feel earned. The replacement format, by trying to avoid the pain, also avoided the depth. Ratings decline, critical pushback, and a sense that the magic couldn't be recaptured. These are predictable symptoms of format that is attempting to solve surface-level issues while leaving the core wound untreated. And the core wound, as the transcript frames it, is this: rescue television depends on participants being salvageable. Not technically salvageable, humanly salvageable. A show can install new equipment and new recipes. It cannot guarantee that a leader will keep standards when nobody is watching. And it cannot guarantee that the person being helped respects the customer enough to deserve help in the first place. This is why the story's next pivot toward the pandemic is more than a historical footnote. It is the first time the context itself changes the moral math of the mission. Because COVID, 19 didn't just hurt restaurants run by careless owners. It hurt good restaurants run by hard-working people who were suddenly facing an external shock beyond their control. The transcript frames this as a moment Ramsay's desire to help reignited. The industry was in crisis, but the nature of the crisis was different. The struggle wasn't primarily incompetence or laziness. It was survival in a disrupted world. This matters because it reshapes the central problem that made Ramsay want to walk away in 2014. If you select restaurants that are struggling despite having committed, receptive owners, you reduce the likelihood of the French ski resort scenario. Owners who resist change, exploit customers, or treat the show as free marketing. In other words, you don't just change the format. You change the pool of human beings you're trying to help. And that is the most credible pathway back. Not a faster timeline, not more dramatic editing, but a fundamentally different selection philosophy. Fewer vanity participants, fewer exploitive operators, more owners who deserve the intervention and will protect it after the cameras leave. The transcript's message is not that Ramsay fell out of love with the idea of saving restaurants. It is that he fell out of love with saving restaurant for television under a structure that too often rewarded the wrong incentives and produced outcomes he couldn't stand behind. If the revival succeeds, it will not be because the industry suddenly discovered new lighting or better music cues. It will be because the show finally accepted the lesson Ramsay learned the hard way. You can't rescue a business without the owner's integrity, and you can't build a sustainable legacy on transformations that collapse the moment the credits roll. The pandemic didn't just disrupt the restaurant industry. It rewrote the meaning of failure. Before 2020, a failing restaurant on television often came packaged with familiar assumptions: bad leadership complacency, poor standards, owners who wouldn't listen. The audience could enjoy the moral clarity of the format. Ramsay arrives, exposes the truth, demands change. If the business collapses later, it feels like a consequence of choices. COVID changed that narrative. Suddenly, restaurants that had survived for decades were brought to their knees by forces no owner could fully control: lockdowns, capacity restrictions, supply chain disruption, staffing shortages, and a customer base reshaped by fear and uncertainty. In that environment, struggling stopped being shorthand for deserved it. Struggling could mean you were competent and hardworking, and still trapped in an economic storm. That shift matters because it directly addresses a psychological wound that the transcript claims pushed Ramsay away in 2014. The sense of futility, the feeling that he was pouring everything into businesses that either didn't want help or couldn't sustain it. If the root problem is owners who won't change, Ramsay burns out. But if the root problem is owners who are doing everything right and still might lose everything, the work becomes meaningful again. It becomes rescue in the literal sense, not rescue as entertainment. The transcript frames this as the moment Ramsay's motivation flickered back to life, not because he forgot what the old format cost him, but because the target changed. He could help restaurants with good bones, committed owners, strong work ethic, a real desire to adapt, rather than wrestling with resistant personalities who treated the show as free publicity. In other words, the intervention could be applied where it had a higher probability of sticking. That is a first strategic lesson of the comeback. The most important format change isn't the camera style or the timeline. It's selection. When Kitchen Nightmares returned in September 2023 after a 9-year absence, the return wasn't just a reboot. It was an attempt to renegotiate the contract between Ramsay, the audience, and reality itself. The old version had an unspoken promise: watch me fix it. The new version, as the transcript implies, tries to be more honest. Watch us try to save what can be saved. This is where Ramsay's on-screen energy becomes more than a personality note. The transcript suggests he carried less of the explosive anger that defined parts of the earlier run. That doesn't mean he became soft. It means he became more selective about where he spends his fury. Anger is expensive. It burns the person holding it. In the older seasons, anger was also a tool, shock therapy for denial. But if you choose owners who are already receptive, anger becomes less necessary and collaboration becomes more productive. And collaboration is the second lesson. The original Kitchen Nightmares often leaned into adversarial storytelling because conflict creates television. But conflict also creates resistance. If you humiliate someone into compliance, compliance may last until the humiliation fades. If you bring someone into shared ownership of change, the change has a better chance of surviving. The transcript hints that the production style evolved too, drawing closer to the tone of the UK version. More problem-solving, less manufactured drama. That shift is not cosmetic. It is a structural attempt to reduce the show's moral risk. When a series leans too hard into spectacle, it can incentivize the very behavior that undermines long-term success. Owners performing for screen time, leaning into conflict, chasing publicity rather than transformation. A calmer, more operational tone discourages that. It makes the show less attractive to participants who want fame more than function. Of course, the show can never fully escape its own paradox. Television thrives on tension. A perfectly healthy restaurant doesn't need a rescue, even in a post-pandemic context. The producers still need stories with stakes. But the transcript's framing suggests Ramsay learned to define stakes differently. The old stakes were personal. Ego clashes, stubbornness, humiliation, redemption. The new stakes are structural. Cash flow pressures, labor shortages, post-COVID customer behavior, menu engineering for margin, operational systems that can withstand volatility. That matters because it gives Ramsay a path back to integrity. If he can frame the rescue as addressing real constraints rather than just punishing bad character, then the outcome, success or failure, feels less like a reflection of his credibility alone. It becomes more honest. A strong intervention in a fragile industry may still not be enough, but it is no longer performance pretending to be a guarantee. This also helps solve the reputational dilemma. In 2014, the transcript suggests Ramsay feared the show's failure rate was damaging his brand, because each closure looked like evidence that his fixes were temporary. In the post-pandemic era, the audience is primed to understand that survival is harder and more complex. That doesn't reduce Ramsay's responsibility, but it changes the public's expectations. It makes viewers more willing to accept nuance. Not every restaurant can be saved, even with perfect advice. The deeper point is that the revival is not merely a return to an old hit. It is a controlled attempt to reclaim the original mission, helping restaurants that deserve to survive, while avoiding the psychological traps that made Ramsay walk away. That means fewer participants who treat the show as marketing, more owners who respect the customer, more businesses where change is not just possible, but wanted. And that sets up the real question that lingers at the end of this phase of the story. If the old format failed because it tried to compress long-term transformation into short-term television, can the new version succeed by aligning incentives, choosing the right restaurants, setting more realistic expectations, and preserving Ramsay's integrity? Because the comeback isn't just about Kitchen Nightmares returning. It's about whether Ramsay can finally make peace with what the show always was. A spotlight that can save a restaurant's moment, but only the owner can save the restaurant's future. The most revealing part of this story is not the cancellation, the comeback, or even the French ski resort that the transcript frames as the final straw. It is the shift in Ramsay's honesty. Because the closer you look, the more Kitchen Nightmares stops reading like a simple reality show and starts reading like a long experiment in whether change can be engineered on camera. At 58, what Ramsay finally reveals in the narrative you provided is essentially a diagnosis. The format, as it once existed, was built to create transformation fast, but not necessarily to create transformation that lasts. And once he accepted that, he had to confront a brutal professional truth. If the majority of restaurants relapse or close, the show's success as entertainment can begin to conflict with his credibility as a chef and businessman. The very thing that made the show famous, dramatic turnarounds in a short time, could also become a reason it threatened his integrity. That is why the French resort incident, in the transcript's framing, matters as a symbol. It wasn't merely a difficult owner. It was an owner who treated customers as trapped, quality as optional, and Ramsay's presence as a marketing tool. In that single setup, the entire moral logic of the show cracks. Because the rescue format depends on a shared premise, that the restaurant wants to become better, that the owner respects the customer enough to try, and that the intervention is an opportunity rather than a weapon. When those assumptions fail, Ramsay's help becomes less like mentorship and more like endorsement. And endorsement is a line he could not keep crossing. The comeback in 2023 is best understood as a corrective attempt, not a nostalgia play alone, but a strategic rebuild of the show's underlying incentives. The transcript suggests Ramsay returned because the pandemic changed the profile of struggling restaurants. The crisis created a new category of participants, owners who were not failing because they were reckless, but because the world shifted under their feet. That distinction matters because it changes the emotional contract. Ramsay is no longer fighting someone's ego as the primary antagonist. He is fighting circumstances, with the owner as an ally rather than an adversary. If you take the transcript seriously, this is the real new format. Even more than production style, it is a filtering mechanism. Choose restaurants that deserve to be saved. Choose people who will protect the change after the cameras leave. Reduce the chances of encountering the kind of resistance that turns the process into futility. But even this reimagining does not eliminate the central tension. A TV show still needs conflict. A restaurant rescue still compresses time. The pressure to deliver a satisfying arc, problem, confrontation, breakthrough, success, will always exist because that is what audiences are trained to expect. The question is whether Ramsay can keep the storytelling honest enough that the rescue is presented as a catalyst, not a guarantee. That may be the most mature conclusion the show can offer. The recognition that Ramsay can provide expertise, structure, and momentum, but he cannot provide character. He cannot provide discipline. He cannot provide integrity. Those things have to live inside the owner long after the episode ends. So when a transcript says the final truth is deeper than any single experience, it points to a wider lesson about the limits of intervention culture. We live in a world that loves quick fixes. 1 week to transform a business, 1 episode to heal a family, 1 confrontation to cure denial. But the real world does not run on episodes. It runs on repetition. Restaurants fail or survive based on what happens on ordinary days, not dramatic ones. And Ramsay, after years inside that machine, appears to have reached a point where he could no longer pretend otherwise. That is why the cancellation call to Fox, described as direct and awkward, carries symbolic weight. It represents a rare moment in television where the star refuses to keep manufacturing a promise he no longer believes he can deliver, not because he lacks ability, but because he recognizes the structural boundaries of what ability can do in a broken system. And that brings a story to its most important unresolved question. Can a revived Kitchen Nightmares avoid the same pitfalls by changing the selection criteria and emphasizing collaboration over humiliation? Can it protect Ramsay's integrity by focusing on restaurants with committed owners and realistic paths to sustainability? Or will the demands of television slowly pull it back toward the same gravity? Bigger conflict, messier personalities, faster transformations, and outcomes that again become difficult to stand behind? Because the real risk is not that some restaurants will fail. That is inevitable in hospitality. The risk is that the show will drift back into rescuing people who do not deserve rescue, rewarding resistance with screen time, and turning standards into spectacle. If that happens, the cycle repeats. Effort becomes futility, and futility becomes burnout. So the end of this story isn't a conclusion. It's a test of the show, of the format, and of Ramsay himself. He has already shown he is willing to walk away when the mission becomes dishonest. Now the question is whether the mission can remain honest while still being television. What do you think matters more for a restaurant rescue show to succeed long-term? The makeover, the menu, and the marketing, or the owner's integrity and willingness to change when nobody is watching?